Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. This is Our Whole Childhood. I am your host, Patrick Tian, and this is the podcast where we discuss everything childhood trauma, from the issues that we experience to the stuff that comes up in our families and to the healing work that we're all trying to get done. If that's interesting to you, let's check out this episode. It's been a while since I just did a podcast-specific episode. Most of the podcast episodes are recycled audio from the YouTube videos that I do on childhood trauma, so it's rare that I just pop on here, but I've been wanting to tell the story for a while, and I kind of want to also do a check-in. It's February 1st in the U.S., and the U.S. is facing a crisis over the overuse of power, over immigration. And in my mind, we are fully dipping ourselves into fascism. And just thinking about what I just said to myself, anytime I hear people kind of talking with that tone and that serious, it's kind of quasi-activism. There's no problem with activism. But historically, I always kind of go, okay, you weirdo. We are dipping into fascism in the U.S. as a childhood trauma therapist, and I am a big fan of history, and I've read a lot about these things. You don't need to be a fan of history to know what's going on, but I think that those who follow me and who follow my work, you're working on yourself, chances are you're just as fucked up as I am about all this stuff. I've been having a hard time getting to my work. The news is overwhelming. It puts me in a place of I'm just simply activated. And I'm activated after doing a lot of work on myself, evident about the story I'm going to tell. But it's a funny thing in the world right now where I feel goofy as a childhood trauma therapist to tell people, keep educating them about their triggers, when I feel like the current climate right now is essentially like childhood 2.0. And I feel weird to draw parallels about how is the present situation different when at the moment we are living through a crisis. We're supposed to be activated. Such a normal response to anything going on. So if you're feeling like I am, I just wanted to set that up front. Just wanted to kind of bookmark that and put it out there. So I feel better when I force myself to kind of engage in my work, which is often about connecting with our past and relating that to the present, regardless of what I just said, and really connecting with each other around recovery. With all that said, I guess this question is, what happens when our unique flashbacks and our body memories, what is it like when those things pass away? What do those things look like after doing so much healing work on yourself that they're more like little things that you notice as opposed to things that shoot through you, like a nightmare, a flashback, a shame attack, responding from some kind of emotional memory or flashback? What does it look like when those things kind of eventually pass away? And I had a really unique experience this summer with my son. Last summer, we went to Ireland for 2 weeks. The first week we spent with family on the west coast of Ireland. This is all around the west coast of Ireland. And the second week, my son and I, he's 14 years old, I wanted to organize a trip with him so that I get time with him before he goes back to school. He's on a funny academic schedule where he goes back to school earlier. And we had an amazing time. The itinerary was we were going to do the Ring of Kerry, which we did. Then we were going to fly to Scotland and we were going to go tour Edinburgh, which we did. And the best part about that trip was I reconnected with a high school friend and fellow musician, and we had a blast. And that experience was better than the beautiful city of Edinburgh. Edinburgh, it's what the locals sort of call it. It was kind of busy in Edinburgh, so I didn't really research well enough that we were there, but there were a whole bunch of festivals going on, yada, yada, yada. But I had this experience. This is the first time in my life where I'm able to actually kind of take these vacations. And we spent 3 days. We hired a driver, a wonderful woman who was showing us around the Ring of Kerry, and we just had the adventure of a lifetime. As we're driving into this place, we had just toured a place called the Dingle Peninsula. Yes, that's a funny name. Yes, you can giggle about it, but go Google it. This is one of the most beautiful places I have ever been to on this planet. I haven't been around that much, but this is just an amazing, amazing place. A peninsula of green just jutting out with rocks. And, you know, there was a Star Wars film that was filmed out there in the Skellig Islands. Just incredible. We had toured that. My son and I are both musicians. We both play multiple instruments. And it was like magical. we bought a tin whistle, and then on the side of the road in Dingle, with a guy kind of selling sort of necklaces and stuff, he got an impromptu tin whistle lesson from a local. We had amazing food, and we were just vibing with our driver, who was a wonderful woman, and we're having the best time. So we leave the Dingle Peninsula after touring there and staying there one night. Then we enter the entrance of County Kerry, the entrance of the Kerry Peninsula, the Ring of Kerry, near a place called Clorglen. I have family from there. And as we're driving in, I had kind of a flashback, because we're driving in, and on both sides of the road are these looming dark, dark green mountains. There's little specks of white, and that's livestock on top of the mountains. It's kind of rainy. It's beautiful. It's dramatic. It's just life-affirming. My body sort of said to me, oh, you've been here before. And through the course of this trip, I was busy that summer. I didn't really kind of think the way that things planned out that way. But I realized that, and I didn't forget this trip prior, I realized in that moment, as I'm driving into the entrance of Kerry and seeing these mountains, that it had been 40 years almost to the week that my father took me to Ireland to visit family under a really nasty, nasty mission that my father had. You know, I'm in this van, and I kind of realized, like, oh my God, I've been here before. And I looked over at my son, and he's totally unaware. He's just taking pictures out of the side of the road. And I just have this moment of remembering the trip that I was on with my dad 40 years ago. So many of you have taken the ACE study test, or the Adverse Childhood Trauma Experiences study test. While helpful in some ways, it's really a rough measure of childhood trauma, which is a common critique of it. It's like, it's not enough. It doesn't measure what is going on with the adults in a child's life. The ACE study is more about the results of the trauma that kids experience, about what is going on in the system that the child is growing up in. It doesn't complete a whole story. It doesn't measure the dynamics of family relationships like marriages, siblings, and parent-child relationships like attachment. When caregivers are abusive, it affects the whole system that the child is growing up in, and we tend to not measure that child's environment. So I actually came up with a clinical assessment that measures unsafe, toxic environments. This assessment was recently published in the Journal of Family Trauma, Child Custody, and Child Development in June of 2025. This assessment can help you get a sense of measuring the toxicity that you grew up in from a family of origin childhood trauma perspective. Even if you know already that something was up, now it is measurable with this test. The questions are also highly reflective, and I actually think the questions are more important than your score at the end of the day, because those questions are really great things to bring into your reflective work or to bring into therapy. You can easily find and take this test at toxicfamilytest.com. What was really interesting about it, I was having a body memory, but it was without distress, if that makes any sense. Usually in the past, before I did any real trauma work, I would have shame attacks. I would have body memories, flashbacks, and this is all sort of semantics about what those things are. These are just emotional experiences where I think our body is saying two things. I think our body is sort of saying, oh, it's happening again. And it's also our subconscious going sort of, hey, have you dealt with this yet? What was profound about this experience is I've been in recovery since the early 90s when I started doing childhood trauma work in a childhood trauma group when I was about 20 years old, and gone through my whole family story, processed a lot of nasty stuff, and had done a lot of work, got into sobriety, did more work, and here we are. I am 40 years old, going through this little mountain kind of entrance. The last time I had been there, I was 8 years old with my very narcissistic, alcoholic, gambling father on a trip that had kind of a dark kind of energy to it. It was weird that it was without distress, which I felt really grateful for. It was almost what would have been a very sort of shameful, activating flashback was more of an experience of like deja vu and just seeing these mountains. I didn't really talk about it with that. I didn't really even feel the need to talk about it with anyone. It was just kind of like I can't believe that I've forgotten that it was like 40 years, 1985 to 2025 in the summer in Ireland, probably close to the weeks even lining up. What does all that mean? What happened in 1985 about this kind of dark trip that my dad took me on? To back up a little bit, I had gone to Ireland with my mother and my two siblings in 1983 before my brother passed away that same year. So the family was already a very toxic, abusive family wrapped up in domestic violence and alcoholism. And then we lose my brother. And through those years, I lost my brother in the first grade, and this trip would have been at the end of the second grade, going into the third grade. And at 8 years old, I'm somebody that can remember a lot of my childhood trauma. I was not doing well. I was very attached to my mother. I really was worried about her. I was worried about her doing things like drinking and driving. It was really bad for me to be separated from my mom or not know what was kind of going on. And both my parents were people who were incredibly emotionally immature. They were in a constant toxic power struggle with each other. And probably my dad sort of said, I'm going to Ireland. There's business I got to take care of. And she's like, well, take Patrick with you. And that was probably a fight. And he probably didn't want it, but he probably lost that fight. But part of that fight, too, was that my mother also wanted her freedom. So off we go to Ireland. We visited my mother's side of the family, and we didn't really stay in hotels. My father would do this thing is that he would kind of show up on family's door and sort of say, well, we're here for a visit, and we would do the visit. And then he said, can you watch Patrick while he would go out? And he might be gone overnight or whatever. He was a man who loved his freedom. He was a man who hated parenting. He was a man who just was not sort of safe at all. All the while just kind of being typically narcissistic in terms of like, you know, being charming or whatever. He did have a jovial side to him that came out more and more when he was on vacation. I'm left with my mom's side of the family, and while I already knew them from the trip in 83, I was incredibly homesick to the point that I don't even think I ate well. Remember specifically sharing a bed with a cousin, and these are all lovely people, but I was just miserable and really missing my mom and worried about her. After that, we went to his sisters, same sort of thing. I didn't really know them at all, but I was in their care for a night or two while he left to do something. And then we get to this third stop around where these mountains come in a place called Killorglin. We went to go visit my step-grandmother. This was an incredibly abusive man. He lost his wife in the mid-50s, my biological grandmother. He remarried later, and he resettled in his hometown of Killorglin. We are visiting this woman, and I don't remember her as being very warm to me, but it was the same deal. Can you look over Patrick while I take off for the night or whatever? And she agreed to that. But years later, what I didn't really realize is that my father was on a mission with that trip. The business that my father was on was around inheritance. As the oldest male in the family, he was the heir of the house that his stepmother lived in. And he shows up with me on her doorstep to say, oh, hey, it's been a long time. You know, I'm going to be selling the house, and I was wondering when you're thinking of moving out. There was probably no communication about this. It was just probably dropped on her. My father was an extremely narcissistic person who didn't understand that other people would be affected by his choices and his decisions. And he's essentially showing up on her door, evicting her. That's who my father was. He showed up on her doorstep. When are you leaving? Can you watch my son? So when I'm thinking back to this, I learned about this mission later at 8 years old. I didn't know what was going on, which is interesting because I think as children, we know that something is going on, but nobody's informing us. He would have never told me about, he didn't really communicate with me at all. He's somebody that saw children as like a need to know basis. He would never have shared with me like, oh, I own this house and she's going to move out. There was no discussion about that. So I learned about the mission after the mission much later. And putting two and two together is my grandfather's second wife, who I learned from a cousin. This woman that he was about to evict was a lovely woman. And can you imagine her energy towards me? She was probably just in shock. So when I think back to this woman, I was already homesick. I don't remember it being really warm and fuzzy. But the poor woman was probably extremely activated. And I would put the pieces together after all that. That is what happened on that mission. We went home, and I believe under Irish law, my father had failed that mission because under Irish law, you can't obviously evict somebody who lives there, the spouse of somebody, just because you're the heir. And unfortunately, my step-grandmother passed away, I think, a year or two later, and that's when he was able to obtain and sell the house. It gets a little bit darker, too, in that same year that when he returned back on this kind of failed mission, I would later also learn many years later, decades later, that my mother also took a separate trip to Ireland without us, more freedom on the two of them, but she also went on that sort of same mission and started asking my father's siblings if it was okay. So it wasn't just my dad's mission, you know what I mean? Like, both of my parents were incredibly emotionally immature, and they had extremely poor boundaries. What is maybe the trauma of all that? Like, why is that? Everybody has their own unique set of trauma. Mine particular was, for however I'm wired, many people who grow up in families who just do shameful things, whether it's substance abuse, really poor boundaries, really off behavior, messy things like poverty, chaos, hoarding. Children wrapped up in that can feel like they're an accomplice. So what I mean by that is, by the age of 8 years old, I didn't like being around my dad because my dad was socially off. My dad could be drunk. My dad was incredibly cheap. My dad could be incredibly insulting to you and not kind of get it. And little kids kind of absorb all that. And maybe you didn't grow up the way that I did or respond to shame in that way. For other people, it can be very different, where the emotional flashbacks or emotional body memories are, let's just say you grew up in a highly, looks really good on paper kind of family. Everything is super tidy, but everything is about performance. And if you fail some kind of performance in life, you may have a shame attack in that way, you know, as a representative of your family. Well, I guess that's a similarity, like you're representing something around perfection, where I felt like I was an accomplice to narcissism. I wouldn't have said it that way at 8 years old, but I felt like I was in cahoots with someone who really didn't give a shit about other people's feelings or the world, or was embarrassing and all that kind of thing. So what was unique around this, or hearing about this, like if I heard about this at 11 or 14, when the story kind of linked up, whether it was my aunt telling me or my mother telling me, like that was kind of what that mission was, or why we went to Ireland in 1985, I would have felt really bad. I would have felt just sort of like, oh, that lady just must have like really hated me that I was with my dad or something. It's just how kids kind of talk. Relate it to things like imposter syndrome. You're representing being like, you're this little dirty kid coming from this dirty family, and you are bound to do off things too, which isn't true, but these are the slimy things that get stuck to us. And what I mean by all that is, I think when I was in school, grammar school, middle school, I carried a level of sort of shame that I was going to do something awful to people and they were going to hate me for it. And again, not everybody has a strategy of meaning making like that, or has a version of shame like that, but that was my version of shame. So that is sort of what happened, and it's really a dark kind of story. Getting to therapy later in life and talking about a whole bunch of things. And this is, I don't even think I talked about this specific story in therapy, but I did talk about how emotionally off and narcissistic and emotionally immature, and what happened to us as kids through all this stuff. The drunk driving by my mother, the narcissism by my dad, the domestic violence, the bullshit that we were sort of fed, and processing all that was a beautiful experience of getting rid of that icky sort of shame. In full circle, as we're driving through in the summer of 2025, 40 years later, and me not recognizing that trauma anniversary of this event, is here's the difference after all that work. I think if I hadn't done any work and I'm driving through the Ring of Kerry or seeing these mountains again, I think my inner child would have gone, I wonder if the people in this town know that we try to evict this lady. What shame kind of does is kind of go global in a way, and thinking, I may not have been a conscious thought, but I might have felt a little bit of shame to be in this area. I might have been wondering if there's anybody from the old school generation of Irish people that would know my father in some way. Again, they're not really conscious feelings, but there's the feelings of not being comfortable in our own skin around a certain area. And I wasn't feeling that at all. I was sort of a representative of myself, probably. That's what my life is like now after doing all this, is I don't represent my father and his bullshit. I don't represent my mother. I'm just sort of Patrick. I'm just sort of the kid who grew up in that family and had his own life and whatever. And I'm detached from their legacy is what I'm trying to say. But I think if I hadn't done that work, I would have been carrying little shadows or residue of that, my father's legacy, through Calorglan, through Kerry. And I find that kind of a fascinating sort of thing. And the really beautiful part about it is the difference on that trip, where my father treated me like a burden and a tag along to be on that trip for the most part. Incidentally, we went on to visit a brother in London on that trip because we were already there. He took me to sort of France for a day. And on paper, that's like, oh, that's pretty cool. And going to those places was pretty cool. Incidentally, I was in London. We heard this rumble in the background because my uncle had lived in London at the time, and we spent like maybe 3 or 4 days with him. And we heard this kind of rumble in the background, and it was actually Live Aid. So I wasn't at Live Aid. I was sort of in the area and could hear this kind of thing. And I do remember things about that trip that stand out to me. Like I was able to buy like a Rick Springfield record, and there's just kind of stuff like that. But it's just, I also really remember this, that in London, my father took me into a bar. He was also an alcoholic and a drinker, and we spent probably 8 hours in this bar, and I was just sort of playing pool for hours. And I remember specifically that the bartender put these like bar rags in the holes because I wasn't technically supposed to be able to be in the place or playing pool at the, you know, so it's just these other things too. But that's another example of, that's my father's legacy. That's not my legacy, to be 8 years old and then have it be like probably like 11:30 on a weeknight where I'm playing pool, you know, and just like, you know, there's plenty of times that I spent most of my childhood in bars, and I can just now imagine bartenders and other people going like, get that kid home, you know? Just keep stressing this point, is I could have felt shame about that because kids are smart. I remember that bartender for a reason, because his energy was like, what is this kid doing here? Kids are smart. They know when the adults are off. So the best way I can connect with you all is actually through my newsletter. And yes, there is the YouTube channel, there's the podcast that I'm doing, and then there's the social media, but those are all for the content. And the newsletter is really about the connection. And it's pretty robust these days. There are childhood trauma topic emails that I send out that just help you when you're up against something big. There are events such as when I go live on YouTube or when I go to do live Q&As in my membership. And my favorite part is I announce when there are childhood trauma groups forming from our trained therapist in the relationship recovery process, which is the trauma model that I talk about in all my videos and all that stuff. So we're training therapists to provide childhood trauma care, and you get announcements about when they're forming groups. And then there's also the notices about when I'm putting out a YouTube video that's new. And there's also offerings like a webinar or free journal prompts on a highly requested issue. And there's also going to be opportunities to better afford all of those resources. So there's a lot. It's really the best way to feel connected to something helpful in your life. And you can get connected with all that at patricktn.com/newsletter. What does it all mean? When I think about this, is the contrast, the difference in a way of 40 years later, I am traveling with my own son through this beautiful part of his heritage and my heritage, and there's nothing icky going on inside me. We are just having an adventure of a lifetime together. We are in love with the food. We are just sort of overwhelmed with the beauty. We're connecting about stuff. I'm watching him have a lesson in how to play the tin whistle from somebody, from this eccentric Irish guy in the Dingle Peninsula. Like you can't, I don't know what I'm even trying to say, like feeling like you wouldn't trade any of it for the world. But most importantly is that my son and I are friends enjoying this thing together, which is a direct, total contrast to me not having that same connection with my own father. And to close the story, like we do the Ring of Kerry, we have all these amazing experiences. We become connoisseurs in the food, specifically brown bread and tea, and I wouldn't trade this for anything wrong. I know I'm repeating myself, but I'm just recalling it all and just really feeling in my heart space about my son and I just sort of enjoying each other and enjoying this time. But the really cool thing is, as we're leaving, we end up in a place called Castletown Bear. And there is a tavern, like a pub called McCarthy's, not McCarthy's, but McCarthy's. And that's one of the final places that we stopped for lunch before spending a night in Cork and then taking a flight to Scotland, to Edinburgh. And the driver wanted specifically to take us there because it's just a really cool place. And we get there and there's like the tavern dog sits at our feet and we're sitting at this table and I had the most amazing sort of salmon plate I've ever had in my life and a cup of tea and brown bread. But the real thing about this place, I loved it so much in my heart because these are the kind of like communities, even though that I grew up in bars, part of it was there was a bit of a community sort of feel to them about being around Irish people. And the owner of this place just walks over to us and she shows us a samurai sword from World War II. And we get in there and there's a dog at our feet, a puppy. The door is wide open. It's a beautiful summer day. We're having this amazing lunch. And the owner says, like, would you like to sort of see this? And she tells us this story that she is a daughter of the owner of McCarthy's. And McCarthy was an Irish doctor in the late 1930s who signed up to be a medic for lack of work in Ireland because Ireland was yet to have been a republic probably by 10 years, an official republic, not a commonwealth, after a revolution and a civil war. So it was a kind of a long time coming of becoming a country. So this Irish doctor joins the British military before World War II for work, and he's being a medic in the British Army. And then World War II breaks out, and he is now stationed in the Pacific. And then he becomes a POW in the Pacific. And he somehow survives an incredible ordeal. When the war is ending by some twist of fate, because he is the highest ranking British POW, the Japanese oppressors of this camp, in a POW camp, they surrender to him and he is presented with this sword. And my son and I, we are kind of World War II sort of history fans and this stuff. So it's like, you can't make this stuff up, where we're having the adventure of a lifetime and we're holding this incredibly beautiful Japanese katana from World War II. And that was the close to this experience. And we just had such a beautiful time. I know many of you got here probably through looking at the YouTube channel, and I want to welcome you to the podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment and maybe leave a quick rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps the podcast grow. It really helps show and reach our new listeners. And please know that I read everyone and take them into my heart when people do leave those reviews. Thank you so much for your support. And to wrap up my thoughts on this, after a lot of work, that is what my life is like now. I'm generally a very happy and content person for the most part when the world isn't dipping into fascism and all that bullshit. But when I am in Ireland, I am at my happiest. And I can't express to you the beauty of having just in one generation the difference of I am there for my son to enjoy my experience with him, contrasted to my dad, where I was dead weight to him. And the damage that comes from just being dead weight to a narcissist. Just very grateful for the therapist that I found and the way my life kind of transitioned. So go to Ireland. It might be the place where your flashbacks go to die. I just wanted to share that kind of beautiful experience. We talk so much about the work and the grueling parts of it and the symptoms that last, but I think in a good enough way, you can get to a point where the flashbacks just become deja vu moments. I really appreciate you hanging out with me through this. I hope you kind of take away with something from this, to keep your eye on the prize about why we're healing. And incidentally, you don't have to have children on your horizon, or you don't, if you know, to choose that you don't want to have children, or if you're just beginning and that's not on the horizon at all, you don't have to have children to break cycles. I'm glad I remembered this, because even if I hadn't had a child and found myself going through this little mountain pass or whatever, there still would have been the beauty of just kind of going like, oh, I'm not my father. Do you know what I mean? Like, I can be clean and innocent and anonymous here and not carry this legacy of what it means to be a Tehan, because the Tehans, in the men in my family specifically, in just these two generations, not the Tehans in general, but family lore is like, that name comes with a lot of negative connotation. So you don't have to have children to experience a certain level of healing that I'm describing here. I'm describing that because of the work that I was allowed to do and very much fortunate and lucky to find myself in. The byproduct of that is being in the world without all that ickiness, to the point that I can be present and just sort of enjoy it and be heart-spaced. So thank you very much for hanging out with me in this story. I hope it was interesting, at least, or helpful to you. And as always, may you be filled with loving kindness. May you be well. May you be peaceful and at ease. And may you be joyous. And I will see you next time.